Hello and welcome to today's Wired Briefing, Global Open Banking Innovation. I'm Natasha Bernal, Business Editor at Wired UK. In today's briefing, we'll be exploring the evolution of open banking, how it is transforming the financial services industry, and the prospect of a global open banking network. Open banking has created a level playing field for companies of all sizes to leverage customer data to create new products and services. But perhaps the most important outcome of open banking and the data surge is the effect it has had on levelling the playing field for a demographic known as the credit invisible population, which are people with little or no viable financial information who may have unfairly suffered due to the lack of data on their credit history. Open banking has helped them to access mainstream finance for the first time. I am delighted to be joined today by Jess Turner to talk about this subject and what the future holds for open banking. Jess Turner is the Global Head of New Digital Infrastructure and FinTech at Mastercard and is responsible for developing and building new products and technologies to enable the future of digital currency, open banking, and APIs, while driving innovation with FinTech companies, governments, and other partners globally. Jess, welcome. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Natasha. It's great to be here. I can't help but say I'm so excited about the topic that I can't wait to jump in, but I really appreciate you having me.
It's going to be amazing. So for all of those who are watching today, we will also be taking questions from our audience. So if you'd like to ask Jess something, please use the Q&A function on your screens, which should be down below at any point, and we'll try to answer as many of your questions as possible in the session. So Jess, I'd like to kick off just by talking a little bit about the road so far. So when it was first introduced, open banking was seen as a way to level off competition and to give consumers the opportunity to switch to different services with ease and get the best deal. But during the pandemic, something else happened. So it kind of helped build out the financial records of that credit invisible population, which I spoke about before. All of these people suddenly joining in on open banking, and also what effect has that influx of new information and new data from people being involved in open banking had on the kind of services that people are being offered?
It's a great question. It's a really important point. So there was a plethora of data years ago, and it continues to expand. You hate to bring up COVID-19, but there was an acceleration to digital, which absolutely is leading into the increase of data that's available. And what that does is it really empowers people to go ahead and use that data in a way that betters their life, and that's different for different people. I can tell you just one stat that I think is pretty important is that 73% of consumers say they're using their mobile banking app more than they did before COVID-19. That's a lot. 73% is a huge number, and you can even see the proliferation of small businesses doing the same. And so, with this increase in data, and with this ability for people becoming a little bit more comfortable to say, I do need to provide more data to potentially get a service I want, even if you think about food delivery and things that people were a little skittish about before, it really opens the opportunity to use that data in a way that consumers are still empowered, small businesses are still empowered to control who and how that data is used, but to give them a better life. And that could mean easier onboarding for things or easier applications for some, could mean more competition for products and services of interest, or it could mean really leveling the playing field in certain regions and countries for inclusion. So it's very broad, but I personally, and maybe biased, I believe more data with the right controls and security around it is really what is really what open banking is about.
Yeah, I mean, it seems very much that people were willing to share more data. We were all going online. There was a sort of, I suppose, desperation point where we realized we couldn't do any of the normal things that we might want to do. Cash became very much superfluous for a lot of people. But I think the interesting point that you made was that people were willing to engage with open banking, whereas they wouldn't have been able to before. In your opinion, what difference has this made for people who have typically been unfairly denied credit or other financial products? I'm talking about people who, just due to the lack of data on them, might have been told, computer says no for things like loans or mortgages or any kind of financial product that they're trying to get hold of.
I believe, back to the point I was making before, having data where consumers are in control of it and can leverage the value is what's going to help in this lending environment. And so, lending is a tricky thing, and you have to imagine it's even more tricky post-COVID and as different ecosystems evolve, because we're in a place in the world where we've really never been before. And when you provide credit or lending in traditional ways, usually there's a fairly long trajectory of how the models work, what it means, and that's how you're able to, as a business, lend money in a way that you don't take too many losses. What I think is fabulous about open banking and hopefully helping to better level the playing field is that you can take things that aren't used in traditional credit scoring, because consumers can say, hey, why don't you take a look at my bank account history? Because maybe I'm a driver, or maybe I'm providing a shopping service, or maybe I have payments that's not traditional. So it's going to show up differently than it would on a traditional score. Or, there's other things I'm paying that today aren't in traditional credit scores, right? They're not considered lending, but if you're paying your cell phone bill every single month on time. And so go ahead and take that. And with that, maybe you can have a different view of if I'm credit worthy or not. And so those are really examples of what this can do. And we have seen that. I'll just use two examples of some start path companies we work with today that are using that. One's Tomo Credit, and it's really about helping immigrants. So, people come to the country, they clearly don't have any credit history. How would they? But what Tomo Credit is doing is saying, hey, let me look at your financial information with your approval and your control. And with that, I can do a better job giving you credit with no credit history. That's very powerful. Mocafy is another one that's very, very much focused on helping to level the playing field a bit more, both in Black and Hispanic ecosystems. And they're doing something similar. They're actually working with more traditional credit score companies to say, hey, listen, let's really look at this financial data with people, again, allowing it. So to make sure that your credit scoring and what you're doing isn't accidentally, creating racial injustice, gender injustice, and how do we make sure that's working? These are really powerful things. And that's the part that gets me excited. So I do feel like open banking will help define the new way of lending that's more accurate, not only for consumers and small businesses, but for the lender themselves to expand their business with lower risk.
You talked about two examples of companies that have been very innovative within this space. I'm wondering, how has the widening of the market impacted the kind of innovation that you've seen, and what can we learn from the kind of lending that's happening elsewhere in the world?
So I think the widening of the market's a really great point. We'll talk today about things in open banking that I understand and I see as emerging use cases, either because they're already active in certain markets or because there's a clear need that we can fill, right? And even if they're not active, we can see why it makes sense. And I do believe open banking is an equalizer between financial institutions and quote unquote fintechs, right? Which is funny, as an aside. I read this article as everyone a fintech, which is kind of true, but we'll use the classification for today. The point I wanted to make about widening the market is that with fintech players coming in and having access to this information, along with banks and financial institutions having the same access, there should be more flexibility on how you do things, like how you pay, how you lend. I do think this idea around financial management in a very different way, this very much fosters that, right? Because if you think about it, we're talking a lot about financial data today, but imagine if you have a tool that really helps you maximize your savings, long-term and short-term, maximizes how and when you're paying bills, which I think is remarkable. I was talking to a company, UK based this week, that's really focused on making sure even your bill pay is optimized and you're using, the right services for what you're doing. I mean, these are really things that are about choice and innovations that I'm not sure people initially were thinking about when open banking started. And so I think this will continue to have flexibility. And for people, that's what it's about. It's about fostering competition. And there's a bunch of innovations, I'm sure, I'm not thinking about, nor are anyone else, right, today that will come along.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting because open banking is one of the very few examples where policy has created such great opportunity. Normally, it's sort of been the thing that comes after opportunity. It doesn't tend to sort of cause it, especially in such an unexpected kind of way. I mean, when you look ahead and what might happen in the months and years to come, where do you think the challenges are for people who are trying to innovate in this space, who are trying to improve their lending, who are trying to create new services and new products for clients? How difficult do you think it will be to replicate some of the successes that we've seen in Europe and elsewhere in open banking and make it a global thing?
It's a great question. There's all good in open banking, but there are layers of complexity, right? So when you start to talk about data and sharing data, it's very, very important that whether it be policy or industry led, that your focus on making sure that data is protected has to be used in ways that don't increase fraud, even if the data itself is protected, but that the use case isn't increasing fraudulent behaviors or activities, and that it's consistent in what people expect, but also that in certain countries and regions, the way you treat that data can not be consistent, right, based on what the policy needs. So to have a truly global open banking platform takes a lot of understanding what will be the global chassis for that innovation and what you're trying to do, but then also the localization to the country level very often, in the US, in some places, even state level, on how that data has to be treated from a policy perspective, security perspective, and use case perspective. And so there is quite a bit of complexity, and there's layers of that within it, which is one of the reasons that we're really excited to be in this, because it's similar to payments in a lot of ways. And so, the standards and mechanisms for sharing that data and the infrastructure and chassis to do that in a big way can add complexity if you're trying to do everything alone. And so we're a big believer in partnerships and collaboration, and it's why we've leaned into a lot of the ways that we're expanding our open banking. And the one thing I'll leave you with is there's kind of a couple ways to think about it. So there's the UK, which has really been regulation driven and policy driven to start, and started the world, right? And that's led to really good innovation. And it's actually led to industry-led innovation that's not directly tied to the regulation and policy, but is advancing the innovation for consumers. Then you have a market like the US that's been all industry-led. There's no regulation today. And so that's really just been about innovation, see what's happening. And, who's to know, regulation may follow. So it's a different sequence. And then you have places like Australia have taken it to another level and have really leaned in with regulation, but much broader. And so it has a bigger tranche of accounts. Mm-hmm. And so it'll be interesting to see the holistic view of how it all comes together. And it is a bit fragmented in the approach and the way it moves forward, region and region, country by country. But what we're hoping to do at Mastercard is bring that together in a comprehensive and cohesive way to help foster innovation with our customers and partners.
Yeah, that reminds me, I read an article this morning arguing that Australia's version of open banking should be the Supremo version of open banking because there was all this sort of inequity, the article pointed out, between sort of very big players and small players still in the open banking space, because it doesn't make sense on a competitive level to share the amount of data that is needed for people to be on a true level playing field. I wonder, you have a global view of everything. Is there any model that you consider to be far advanced compared to others? Is there any open banking that you think is the better version of open banking currently, or something that we might be all moving towards, whether it's Australia, which is the more we're going to focus on data sharing, or the UK, where it's more we're going to force you to data share? I'm not sure which is the best option, but keen to hear what you think.
I'm supportive of the idea of open finance.
Yeah.
The premise and the principles behind wanting to do this, regardless of it being industry-led or policy regulation-led, is to have more innovation and more competition for the betterment of consumers and small businesses and big businesses in some way. But really where the inequities probably sit most is in consumer and small business. And so if that's the principle of doing this, I believe in open finance, and I believe in doing it in a safe and secure way, which is really important. And so doing these things in a way that does not better the ecosystem or disadvantages a player in the ecosystem is not the winning way. But doing it in a way where it has a comprehensive schematic and policy-based approach so that everyone in the ecosystem can actually do what we're talking about, which is innovate to have more competition for the consumer versus being disadvantaged unfairly. That I believe in. Like we need to keep leaning in there. And so that's the point. And so with that, expanding how many areas of data should be exposed, whether that be through policy or industry led, I think is good. But it's how it's being done, which is really, really important. And I think that's at the heart of it. And so that's why I think in certain markets where it's being done and it's more industry led, but maybe not in the safest or most secure way, or in a way that's not disadvantaging one side of the ecosystem, that's where I think regulation and policy can help. If regulation and policy is so restrictive that it's doing the opposite and creating so much friction that it's stopping innovation, that obviously doesn't help. And so for me, it's kind of bringing it to the center. But that was my very long-winded way of saying I believe in open finance over the longer term, so there's more competition.
That is absolutely my train of thought. It makes sense to have regulation kind of pushing things forward, but not so much if it hampers, ends up doing the reverse, which is what we're seeing in a lot of other sides of tech, sort of unintended consequences to regulation. I wanted to delve into some of the data uses that we've kind of mentioned before. Obviously, with this influx of huge amounts of information, companies are able to share, codified information with each other, and with the sharing of such personal data, there's always some risk of profiling or algorithmic bias, even with the relative anonymity provided by APIs. I'm interested in your perspective. What are lenders and payment processors doing to address these privacy concerns, and how can they be held accountable for the guardrails that are still needed on open banking data sharing?
So I believe trust is critical in this hyper-connected digital environment across the board. I've said it a few times, and I say it because I think it's very much at the cornerstone of why this matters. Consumers own their data. We've been saying that for a long time. They need to be at the heart of in the center of the control of that data, and ensuring greater transparency is a key part of that. So even if a consumer owns their data and all the right policies and procedures are put in place, if the transparency and clarity isn't there for the consumer, it's not as powerful as it should be. So there'll be a big focus on that. How do we ensure that? I believe in the industry. How do we ensure that not only do consumers have control, but there's transparency, they understand it, and it's something they can act on fairly easily. I also think with the significant benefits we talked about with open banking and open finance, we should only be able to do that in a way that has a betterment for the ecosystem. And companies need to treat that data with respect, which means consent by consumers is important and critical when it has a trade for them, either way. So even if it's beneficial, the consumer needs to consent to it, I guess is my way of saying that. And it has to be used for the intended purpose.
Yeah. The concern is very much that the reverse of what we hope would happen and is happening will come to play, which is that people could be discriminated against because of the amount of data that suddenly is out there about them. And that's an interesting kind of point where it's like, do you feel like in the financial industry people are being given enough consent at the moment, or do you feel more needs to be done there?
I believe as the use cases evolve, more will be done on the consent side. So in the traditional financial ecosystem, a lot of consent is there, a lot of consent. And there's a lot of regulation and policy for traditional lenders. Mm-hmm. I believe that as you broaden the ability to take advantage of all these new use cases, having consent be in the forefront for the consumer and making sure it's clear that that data is being used for that consumer for the intended purpose and only for that intended purpose is a really important thing. And so I think these consumer-centric data principles need to be embedded in every use case that's moving forward. And I believe there's a fine line, like we just talked about before, which is traditional lending and policy and regulation, and that's inclusive of how data is used and consent, and then also new innovations. And then how do you make sure that you're giving consumers the right amount of consent, transparency, and control, but without so much regulation or restriction that these new use cases we're talking about end up being something that don't come to fruition. But it comes back to, it sounds very basic, but if you have a consumer-centric data approach in your business, this shouldn't be hard. I mean, that's the foundational principle, and you should be building and architecting your lending products and every other product around that, right? That comes first.
You mentioned earlier that there are companies out there that have entered into data sharing partnerships, even though there's no regulation to force them to do it. I wonder, and this is perhaps something that has no answer, but I will ask it anyway. Do you think that we will reach peak open banking? And if so, when do you think that will be?
I believe we've only begun to scratch the surface on open banking, and that there's a huge appetite to do more. I think as we advance some of the things we've talked about today, you'll see scale pick up more quickly, because I think there'll be more use cases and consumers will have more trust globally, because the level of trust in open banking and sharing data is also different country by country and with different account by account. I think data availability and data quality, which we haven't spent a lot of time on today, is a key fundamental. So having access to data, but not having it be clean and have the highest level of quality, isn't really that helpful, right? And so that takes time and algorithms and models. And so we'll continue to work through all of that. And I think once you start to see that really blossom in a way that can scale, will be where it peaks. And like every new innovation, all the intelligence that can be applied to the data sources we have and be used to help advance other use cases will only foster more innovation, which will help it scale. But I believe we've just started and really scratched the surface, and there's so much more to come. But I do believe it is a fundamental part of what financial services will be in the future.
Mm-hmm. We've spoken about the challenges that open banking must overcome and the real big pressure that financial institutions are under to innovate and leverage consumer data. Where do you see the next frontier for open banking?
The next frontier. I think the next frontier for me would be in many places. If you couldn't tell earlier, I have a bias on the lending side because I feel it's subtle, I know. And the reason for that is because I really do think in a lot of regions around the world, like LAC, for example, I believe it really will help level the playing field for true inclusion, for people to take advantage of the modern economy in a way we haven't really been able to solve for before. And so because of that, I do think that will be a huge catalyst, really, into many other things. And so I believe in the lending use case. I believe in it full-heartedly, and I believe it's a global advance in open banking. I also believe new ways to pay, which many people have talked about, is another, and that's about choice. Mastercard's a multi-rail company. That's not a secret. We've been one for a very long time. And it seems that when you say things like, oh, it's a choice to pay, it may not seem meaningful. It's very meaningful, because how you pay and how you move money has cost implications. It has time implications. It has security implications of protection for that payment. And in a world that's so digital now and so global, it's only more important that there be choice. So that's another really meaningful frontier. The last one I'll leave you with is it's just going to make things easier. Yeah. So it's the more access you have to these different financial accounts that you want to link them to in some way, the easier you can do that, that's secure and protected with someone you trust, the more likely you're going to go ahead and expand the products, services, and offerings you want, and willing to do new things, right? If you think about it just for yourself, every time you have to key in a complete account number with all of the different verifications to try something new that maybe you're not aware of or not used to. It's a lot of friction. Sometimes you just don't do it, and you might be losing out on something that would be really good for you. And so I think that's another area that you'll see a lot of growth.
And again, that kind of goes back to your point about payments, which I know you focused on a lot, which is that was the big challenge for payments, to make it frictionless, so that if you show up anywhere and you want to use your card, you're not going to be declined. Like, the objective is never decline, right? It's always to make it as seamless and as pain-free as possible. And I suppose that for open banking would be definitely a goal. I think we should move on now to some of the questions that have come in live from our audience, because we are running out of time slightly, and I want to be able to do at least a couple. So we've had a few questions actually about the use of data, and I think this from an anonymous attendee who did not want to leave name is really interesting, because this is one of the challenges that is similar to the one that you mentioned of people coming from a different country and having no data history. It's kind of the same thing. Like, will open banking help the renting population be able to borrow for mortgages? There's a large discrepancy between large rent bills and smaller mortgage repayments, yet people's history of paying rent does not help with getting a mortgage. Now, that's something that, especially in big cities, is a huge problem, because it's like, wait a second, if I'm paying £1,500 a month for my rent, how could I not afford a mortgage of £700? So I wonder, do you think this is going to be something that open banking can solve?
Absolutely. That's a great use case. It's a perfect use case. Rent, we talk about a lot. Rent is one of the areas in the US today that is looked at for this kind of new data supply for credit. It's also used as another element for increasing your traditional credit score if you don't have one, where you can opt in. There's a product called Experian Boost, where you can opt in as a consumer and say, hey, I know I don't have traditional credit history, or maybe even I do, but I'd like to give you access to my financial data to give you more information that you can use and boost my credit score. And so I believe that's a perfect use case. It's exactly why I think this innovation needs to happen. And it's also why it's important that this data quality piece I just spoke about is really important, because a rent payment looks very different, could look very different in many different ways, right? So it's about connectivity and access, but it's about knowing which data components within those accounts are in fact rent payments, so that we can make that ubiquitous for everyone in the ecosystem to look at.
Yeah. And then we've got another question from Mohammed, who asks about privacy, but in a different way than what I asked before. It's not so much about the way companies are going to be using our data to make judgments about us, but it's more about the sharing of data and what that could lead to do in terms of impact on our privacy. So he asks, how can we ensure end users that such untraditional data is being used in a safe manner that does not compromise their privacy or subject them to fraudulent activities in the future? So we're talking more about cybersecurity rather than actual, judgment from the part of companies that are doing lending and payments.
It's a good question. And it goes back to the premise of making sure that the entity that's pushing or enabling that data use has the right principles, programs, and infrastructure to secure that. So we spend a lot of time talking about, how does the data get there? Is it the actual data? Is it hashed or not? There's a lot of talk about tokenization, which has many different, what I'm learning as a payment geek, is that it has different definitions depending on what industry you're in. But it's a foundation to making this ecosystem work, is that if the data is used as the consumer wants, that it's being used for what's it intended for, that it's safe and securely sent there, and that it has an ability to get taken back at the consumer's desire, all with obviously cybersecurity being at the forefront of what we're doing and looking for.
This is brilliant. Right, I think that's about all we have had time for today. Thank you so much, Jess, for your time today and for sharing your insight, despite all of the problems we've had technically. Thank you very much for taking the time. If you enjoyed the session, please do check out our other episodes of Wired Briefings at wired.co.uk. If you would like to hear more related content, then please do check out our upcoming event, Wired Money, which will be returning on October the 13th. I wanted to say a thank you so much to Jess again, final thank you, and to everyone watching the session. Thank you, stay well, and we'll see you soon.